Hey guys, today we're going to explore some objections to Hume's theory, and I would really like to get into some Kant, because I think Kant really provides the best reply to Hume, but using Hume's terminology and Hume's point of view. So we're going to add a bit extra when compared to what the textbook is offering, just to give you a bit more of an in-depth criticism of Hume. And I'll be providing that, but it might be a really good idea to understand this in a very deep way. The reason for that is because it will show that you have a much broader understanding of the study design and the texts that have been provided. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to revise our understandings of Hume, and then we're going to study objections that have been brought up with regards to Hume's theory. And in particular, not an objection, but a way out provided by Kant. We will consolidate what we've learned, we're going to clarify our misunderstandings, and we're going to study refutations and objections. So, score yourself on these success criteria for me, please. And then from there, would you draw a train with carriages? And you should remember that the train with carriages represents what Hume refers to as a train of thought. That'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to let you do this yourself. I want you to go to this real-time board that I've got here. You'll find it up on the Google Classrooms posting for revision and objections. And I want you to have a look at the summary I've put up of his philosophy by writing, when I was basically going through and writing my own notes. These are notes, not just the non-linguistic representations. So what you'll see are a series of web notes, because that's how I like to take notes. Look, something like this with non-linguistic representations that I've drawn, yeah? I did this last year to provide people with an example of what it looks like when I take notes and to guide them through the process. Now, I've been checking up on your notes and regularly getting a feel for what they mean and how they work, and so I'm pretty happy with them, but I still think just flicking through what I've written and comparing my notes with your notes would be a really good idea. So could you do that for me? Thank you. Alright, so the second task is to change my mind, or change Hume's mind. So I've got two images here, 1, 2, and these images again are lifted straight from this section. And they outline tasks from the textbook. I prefer you to, you've all bought the textbook, so I prefer you to look at page 168 and 169, then read it from here. You've paid for the textbook, so use it. Now, you know, they are based on criticisms that have been explored by many philosophers later on. I don't know why the references to the philosophers weren't made in the textbook, but they haven't been. So it's just really important that you read through these and kind of anticipate what your own reflections or your own objections would be, alright? So the first one is, Hume insists that we're mistaken when we suppose that things that change over time. But are we really mistaken? Examine the argument Hume presents to support your view, and this is where you need to convince people. So I want you to do this individually, and I'll let you share your answers later. The job of you, not your team, is to convince the class that it is Hume who is mistaken here, not our traditional intuitive view of what essentially is the same object over time. Okay, so stop now and do that one. The next thing is, Hume argues for a bundle theory of self, as I said, the experiential view of the self. Yet this self for Hume has no subject, i.e. there is nothing behind it other than the bundle, right? That is, there is no owner of the bundle, okay? Is this a coherent view? Your job, before you get together in teams, is to write an argument for how actually there needs to be an experiencer that owns this bundle, that is actually the owner of the bundle, therefore proving Hume wrong and saying, yeah, there is a subject, there is an owner, okay? Go for it. Next, I want you to say that we have this idea. Well, Hume says that we have thoughts that resemble and cause one and each other. So we have associations between thoughts, and we use them to insert thoughts into our train of thought and allow for rapid recall, right? Hence the train of thought theory. Now, the job of you, before you get in your team, is to say, is this a proper account for how consciousness really works, or does consciousness play a more active role in recalling such information? Can you do that for me? The next thing is Hume's empiricism commits him to admit something exists only if it can be perceived by the senses. But even then, if we read Hume's empiricism correctly, really the only thing we can be 100% certain of is sense data. But just because we do not perceive the self during our perceiving does not mean that there is no such thing as the self. The job of your team, which means you before you get into your team, is to convince the class that Hume's empirical arguments should not convince us that there is no self. I.e., can the self still be there if you're not conscious of it? And if you remember at the start of his reading, he talked about the self as being a pure, constant, over time, unchanging impression that there is a self, which is, of course, something that's impossible to have because our attention focuses on many different perceptions and creates many different impressions almost at the same time. But is that really a valid argument? Okay, so stop, write your arguments, and soon I'm going to let you guys get together in teams and just nut it out and explore the answers that you've written. Okay, now's the time where we need to take notes, because this is really important. I want to explore Kant's claim that there is a transcendental subject, which implies that there is a transcendental self, okay? Now, if we remember, Hume was an absolute empiricist. He believed that sense data was the only thing you could know for certain, which kind of implied that something needed to be sensed to be known, to be known. And therefore that ideas and anything that is produced through relationships of resemblance, contiguity, or cause and effect are just subjectively created ways of organizing and associating that information together so it can be easily recalled and inserted into our train of thought. So Hume really did believe that there wasn't a subject, there wasn't a center in the bundle theory of self. There wasn't really a center of the experience, and if there is, it's just some kind of phantom created by the subjective construction of ideas of cause and effect and resemblance, okay? So really, again, the bundle theory of self doesn't have a subject at its core. There's no possessor or owner, it just is a bundle of thoughts. That's what Hume argued. But we're going to find out that Kant would really disagree with that, okay? Now, Kant, remember, took on board Hume's ideas. He said, look, there are some things which are just unknowable. They transcend the limits of the human mind, and these things are called nominal. However, we do live in a world which is a recreation of that. It's recreated as the senses detect that information, and we make sense of that information, and we inhabit a world which is created by our minds, and that world is called the phenomenal mind. Take a note. So according to Kant, there are two worlds. There's the nominal world, which is the world outside our subjective experience, and there is the world that we construct, and therefore we inhabit, which is called the phenomenal world. Remember, this relates very much to what Nagel was bringing up when he was talking about the categories of the human mind and human experience. And this relates also to a criticism of Hume, okay? Take a note. And Kant really questions this idea that there is no centre of human experience. It's just a bundle. He says, I don't know about that, right? Because even though he says, look, yeah, there are things that are completely beyond our reach. And you know what, Hume, to a certain extent, you're right. I totally agree with you that we do live in a world that is constructed by our minds, and we don't know for certain if it is an accurate representation of it. I totally agree with you, Hume. We still have this thing called experience. We still experience experience. Take a note. So it's worth knowing that in many ways Kant kind of agrees with Hume, but he puts this kind of assumption that the world that we inhabit is different from the world that we perceive and experience. He puts that into two nice, neat little categories. We've got the phenomenal and we've got the nominal. And he says, well, you know, your claim about the bundle theory of self, or your claim about the self, is that, you know, there is no possessor, but you do acknowledge that there is such a thing as experience. We do have experience, and that's really important. So Kant wants to move over and say, look, I'm going to focus on what experience is, and I'm going to engage in a very special kind of argument, which is called the transcendental deduction. Now, the transcendental deduction is an argument that seeks to question and reflect on experience, and it asks this one really important question. When reflecting on what experience is, what is the necessary condition? What is a necessary must-have condition for experience? Can you take a note? Yeah, so again, your note should have said something like, you reflect on what experience is and you ask yourself what is an absolutely necessary condition for that experience to occur. So keep in mind, right, that this is where he gets to deal with Hume, right? Hume says we have experience. We might have a phantom self, right, which is generated by this bundle, but we still experience it. So Kant says, okay, well, you acknowledge that we have experience, that experience exists. So let's ask this really important question. What is a absolutely 100% necessary condition for experience to occur? And this is really important because this allows him to deal with Hume. Take another note. All right, and so he talks about this really important concept. It's a big word for strange things, right? It's called the transcendental unity of apperception. The best way I can explain it is by example first, okay? And it goes like this. If you have a sore leg, your experience is never that, oh, there is a sore leg in this room. Your experience is, look, I have a sore leg. You know what I mean? You experience yourself at the center of all your perception, right? And this means that in order for experience to occur, the self must be at the center of that experience. And one thing to remember too is that in order for experience to occur, the self must be at the center of experience, because how else would you distinguish between yourself and all the other sense data that you have? Take a note. So experience is absolutely, totally impossible without a self being at the center of that experience. Or I should say, being at the center of that experience, or being at the center of your perception. Because how else would you make your sense data intelligible? How else would you divide yourself between the sense data? How would you also be able to apply what we call the categories of understanding that we covered when we were looking at Nagel to the sense data and turn it into intelligible forms, you know, from the random pixels of a camera to a recognition of the face, okay? There needs to be a self that applies these categories. It performs the judgments of these categories when looking at sense data. Take a note. There also needs to be a self at the center of the sense data in order to understand and to negotiate and work through it. So there's two things the self does. It applies the categories and it understands itself at the center in order to differentiate itself between the outside world or the phenomenal world, not the nominal world because it doesn't know the nominal world, but the outside phenomenal world that it constructs and the self, okay? So therefore the self must exist. Take a note. And this is where he's undone Hume. He's looked at the nature of experience and a necessary condition for it, and he said experience and perception and making sense of perception and the application of the categories to do that, it's just not possible without having a self there. So there must be a self. What the self is in its nature, he would say, look, Hume, I agree, I don't know. It's a completely nominal, or what we call a transcendental self. It transcends the realms of what a person can understand using the phenomenological understanding. But it exists. It has to exist, otherwise experience is not possible, right? So take a note. Alright, so what we've got here effectively is a really well-developed criticism against Hume. It doesn't deny what Hume said, that there are subjectively created ideas or impressions that we have that construct our understanding of the world. In fact, it uses that understanding that we have a subjective creation of the world that we inhabit and tries to explore, well, what's the necessary condition to generate that? And it says, look, there's a self, and that's it. So we have looked at what we've learnt. We've gone through a summary. We've tried to develop our own understandings of criticisms, and we've also tried to develop our own understandings of what we don't understand and clarify it. And we've looked at our own suggested refutations, and we've explored a pretty strong one, which was developed by Kant. So score yourself on the success criteria, and then, once you've done so, pretty pleased with the chair on top, come and talk to me if there's something you don't understand. Cheers.